The 2022 Norwegian horror film Good Boy is a very cruel movie, one that I think is severely underrated and also one that shows that you do not need a budget to make a great work of horror cinematic fiction. So long as you have a good idea and a well-written script that can stand on its own. Everything about this is incredibly cheap. They filmed this thing for just $8,500, at least from what I can tell online, and it looks it. But that doesn't matter, as it is legitimately one of my favorite horror movies of the past decade that you should absolutely check out. It tells the story of a single woman named Sigrid, who goes on a date with a young, wealthy, famous, and handsome man named Christian, who's the son of a well-known deceased businessman, and his wife, who's equally dead. They get along. So much so that after their first date, she goes back to his large house where he supposedly lives alone to have a couple of drinks before the night is through, only to discover that Christian's dog, Frank, is actually a man in a dog suit who refuses to admit that he's an adult human being. Sigrid is justifiably terrified of this, but Christian's hot and he's got money, so maybe she thinks there's more to this than how it seems on the surface. Good Boy is indirectly through this kind of a queer film in this light in a very funny way, or at least a film that is chiefly concerned with depicting queerness, but maybe not so much in a positive way. Clearly the dynamic between Christian and Frank is at least somewhat sexually motivated. How could it not be? The title of the film itself, Good Boy, is deeply synonymous with gay and queer men. Their relationship is codependent to the point that Christian even takes Frank outside to use the bathroom every single time that he has to go. Even if Christian is straight like he claims to be, everything about this reads as at least queer, in a sense that it is a dynamic that exists solely and entirely outside of the realm of traditional heteronormativity within one's lifestyle. This almost becomes a parody of modern culture that has a fairly conservative bent to it, in that Sigrid does not want to call attention to the obvious sexual play that is going on here between Christian and Frank, out of a fear of being labeled as rude, or being seen as a bigot for kink-shaming them. So, don't ever say that I blanket hate all works of art that are made from a conservative perspective, because that isn't actually true, just, most of them. She clearly is uncomfortable with this and finds it to be strange behavior, but puts on a happy face that clearly indicates that she's worried about how she herself will be perceived if she voices these concerns. She's placed in this obviously sexual space that exists within this home, which is fine for them, they can do whatever they like, but is also not particularly fine to place her within this obviously sexual scenario, within a private home against her will, and not even warning her first about what is happening here, where she's then made to feel as if she's a bigot for not accepting their lifestyle. Like if someone came to your house that you didn't know and they knocked on your door and you opened it fully nude. Yes, it is your home, and also you probably have the right to do that, but also that's something that you should not be doing to somebody who does not know you, who is not consenting to that, or is mentally prepared to see that. But all of this is, kind of a half skip and a jump from modern puritanical takes about not wanting to have kink at pride events, which is a stance that fundamentally sides with the police and the right in their general campaign of respectability politics for all queer erasure in public spaces, as the same line of reasoning are used against such events, saying that people who see these things in public cannot consent to them, despite the fact that them being at such an event willingly is in itself a way of them giving consent to see those aspects of queer culture just in a non-verbal fashion, which is a culture that is fundamentally surrounded around sex and sexuality. Removing the sex from queerness is to remove queerness itself. And in that, I think it's a tricky line to walk within a film, even somewhat harmful. But still, despite that, I find it as a work very engaging in what it is able to do as a thriller, that constantly dances around the uncanny, and the fact that you never really truly know anyone's actual motivation. And so, as to not seem as if she's a hateful person, to not come across as breaking a boundary by even being a little bit rude. She stifles her genuine gut feelings of red flags to the point of walking deeper into the situation with blinders on. So much so that she quickly becomes accustomed to this false reality they have built within the house, of actually seeing and treating Frank as if he were actually a dog. Petting his belly, playing with him on the floor, taking him for walks. Frank is normalized within the house to be a dog. That is how the film itself presents him to us. In private, Christian tells her that when he was a child, he was a very lonely boy, and that the only person that had ever been there for him in his entire life has always been Frank, and that Frank has always just felt as if he were a dog. And once he had the wealth to be able to sustain that reality for his friend, that is what he did. I love that the film starts from Christian's perspective, and then shifts to hers after the first few scenes. because in that we can gather that Christian is a very anal retentive person. He's obsessed over others' perception of him, and is somewhat vulnerable over the optics of Frank living within the home with him. He cares about his looks. He cares deeply about presentation in all forms, about the sheets on the bed, the presentation even of the food that he cooks for Frank. I think a very sharp detail in this is how clean Frank's dog suit is, despite the fact that he spends all of his time on the ground. A testament to how Christian runs this house, and his obsession with cleanliness. The only time that we ever see Frank out of his suit is a quick shot in this opening, where it lies on the bathroom floor as we hear Frank in the tub being cleaned, insinuating that Christian will even have to go so far as to break their created reality to maintain the cleanliness of their home. The only instance that we ever see of Christian being willing to treat Frank as if he's a human man. There is a key line of dialogue, I believe, earlier in the film that is crucial in understanding where they're coming from a filmmaking perspective, as when Sigurd asks about what their date that night will be like. Christian responds, asking how a night home alone with some Hitchcock and some Bolognese sounds. And there's a wink in the direction that we're going to take, as this film structurally is very Hitchcockian in nature. As like many of his works, such as the sudden death of the protagonist in Psycho, here we have a mid-film shift that is a very different tone and genre. As the first half is very much centered in this very bizarro, uncanny rom-com styling, and the second is rooted in the stylings of a very classical psychological paranoia thriller. As when the couple goes on vacation, Sigurd is left alone momentarily with Frank as Christian leaves the room to get another bottle of wine, and the dog then uses the opportunity to lift his mask briefly to reveal his true face, saying to her, "You have got to help me, this man is fucking insane," before turning back around and becoming a dog again. And in this, its lens of how it views sexuality may very well embrace Psycho in more ways than one, an inheritor of a legacy that is wrapped in anti-trans and anti-queer fear-mongering. Which this moment leaves us with a second act where we have these three people alone in a remote wilderness, one of which is an innocent third party who clearly does not have all the information that she needs, one who says they are using their resources to facilitate a non-traditional lifestyle for their platonic lifelong friend, and another who says that the other is a dangerously ill man, with a possible third reality lingering over her, where both men might be working together to gaslight this woman. And there are hints peppered throughout the film earlier that both men might be liars, such as us not knowing what actually happened to Christian's parents, a line where Christian jokingly asks Sigurd if she would like to have sex with Frank, and long shots of Frank watching the couple where any possible emotion could be projected onto the blank canvas that is this dog, mixed with the overexcitement that he shows when she first comes to the house, getting up in her lap and pawing at her stomach and chest to such a degree that Christian has to yell at him and tell him to leave the room for misbehaving so badly. Now, for me, all of this does end in a decent but ultimately unsatisfying way, in that after that initial mid-film twist, we don't have another big surprise in store for us. The film plays it too safe, and makes what we first believed to be true the reality of the situation. Christian is indeed insane, Frank is being held here against his will, and then it plays out as a battle of strength, where a Stockholmed Frank and a physically weaker Sigurd try to overcome the physically imposing tall figure of Christian. Which is fine, I'm not mad about it, but it would have been nice to have a secret third thing that we're not expecting. For instance, if it were my script, I would have gone deeper into Frank as a physical manifestation of how people cope and manage trauma, both in how he had a troubled childhood, and literally decided to transition into a different form of life to deal in part with how he had been treated, but also as a lingering ghost of trauma. He's always there in the room with them. Whether they're paying attention to him or not, he's always there. Not all that unlike real-life traumas that follow us along like faithful dogs. I think on a metaphorical level, the script could have been a little bit more thought out. It sort of feels like a letdown to set up this Hitchcockian type movie, where the ending plays it fairly safe. But that's not to say that there's not a lot that I don't love about this third act, especially in how it plays in subtle hints of domination. Christian spitting in Frank's food before feeding him, making Frank roll on his back and show him his belly when they get into a physical fight, fully embracing the queer undertones of the movie and ripping Frank's pants open to spank his bare ass. Snapping his fingers at Sigurd and telling her to sit, it showcases a greater problematic picture of how Christian sees people as a whole, as exemplified by the very dour ending, where Frank remains a dog, but now has a new dog companion in the form of Sigurd. Christian will continue this behavior. He's not grown, he's not been stopped. He simply will continue to treat people like dogs and then make dogs out of them. We are left with this final horrifying image of a little blonde baby being fed out of a dog food bowl, which leaves us with multiple questions. Is Christian the father, or is Frank the father? And if the latter is true, has this whole thing been an elaborate ruse to breed Sigurd to produce puppies? The whole thing is incredibly fucked, and overall the movie is actually fairly problematic in its depictions in several ways. But even so, there's just something strangely transgressive and taboo about the whole thing that won me over, and has wormed its way into being one of my favorites to show people.